Houdini contexts have their own strange language. You'll often hear sops, dops, chops, pops within the Houdini communities, and on the forums they refer to the contexts, which are the operators in Houdini. So for example, we'll have SOPs, which are the surface operators. That's for modeling geometry and traditional scene layout and stuff like that. We'll have DOPs, which is the dynamics part of Houdini. That actually includes POPs, which are the particle operators, because back in the day Houdini only had particles, but obviously when we added all the other dynamic stuff it made sense to include POPs as part of that. Then we also have CHOPs, which is the kind of channel operators, where we can do sort of real-time stuff and other signal processing within Houdini. We also have SHOPs, which is the shader operators, where you used to have to actually write shaders from the ground up. That was a bit tricky for most people, so Side Effects put in a higher level version of that called matte, which is a bit more like the hypershade, where you can actually make layered shaders rather than having to write shading models from the ground up. We also have VOPs, which is the visual programming environment for VEX, which is Houdini's embedded language. We'll discuss that a bit later on. And we have the new LOPs, which are the layout operators. This is the USD environment, where we can lay out scenes following the universal scene description from Pixar there. And we also have ROPs, which are the render operators. This is the output nodes, where we can output all the data from Houdini. And that's managed now by another new context called TOPs, which are the task operators. This allows us to procedurally manage complex tasks within Houdini, anything from wedge test to managing complete complex pipelines. And then finally we have COPs, which are the compositing operators. This allows us to manipulate all sorts of image data before and after sort of processing with it. So Houdini uses these contexts to try and separate the various production pipelines down into more distinct tasks. So each context has its own suite of nodes exclusive to it, and it can easily pass data to the other contexts. For example, in your general workflow, you might start in SOPs, the surface operators, because we nearly always deal with geometry, and then we'll pass that geometry data to DOPs, the dynamic context, for simulation, and then we'll bring that data back into SOPs so we can see our geometry moving with that simulated data, and then we may go into matte to develop a shader, and then apply that shader back to the geometry in SOPs, and then we'll translate all of that stuff into LOPs to lay out and make the look development of the final scene, and then we might go into TOPs to automate the rendering the various elements and the variations that we might need from that. So altogether, the various contexts complement each other and help the data move around Houdini in a much more smooth and distinct way. So let's see how that compares to Maya. So if we look at this little chart, we can see that SOPs is basically similar to the normal Maya interface. That's where we deal with the geometry, we do all the modeling every day. And then Houdini has its DOPs for all the dynamics. Now Maya doesn't really have an environment for all the dynamics, but Maya has its various modules. We can do some dynamics in Bifrost, we can also do dynamics in Nucleus, and we can even do some different dynamics in Mesh. The difference being is that these modules are quite distinct, and it's not easy to share the data between them. As far as CHOPs goes, I don't think there's much of there is an equivalent in Maya for sort of the signal processing. SHOPs and matte, they're equivalent of the hypershade. VOPs, interestingly, the new Bifrost board is basically equivalent to VOPs, the way that it allows us to manipulate data. We have LOPs. There again, there's no equivalent really in Maya, although Maya does support USD objects, and in theory you could sort of bring in and make a scene with USD inside Maya. We have ROPs, which are the render operators, so that would be equivalent to the render globals in Maya, and also the various cache menus where you can export sort of cache data, and in fact anywhere else in Maya that you can send stuff out would be the equivalent to what ROPs would be inside Houdini. TOPs, there is no equivalent at the moment, and there is no compositing or COPs equivalent in Maya, although you can do some basic color correction of images within the hypershade, so I suppose that is fairly equivalent. So let's pop over and have a look at some examples.